Okay, let's then turn to chapter 10. In 1 through 7, the apostle had made reference to these false teachers, but now it seems he's addressing them directly. As I mentioned, some people would argue that this was a letter that was written at a later date. There's no evidence, manuscript evidence to that. But even if it was, everything is the same. It's about the same time and it's the same situation. The issues are all the same. But I don't feel that we need to see it as separate, but rather that the apostle has done what sometimes we do, we leave the most difficult to the last. Defended his ministry, celebrated the fact that they've been reconciled through the painful letter or the severe letter, dealt with the offering issue. Now he feels that he has to address directly those few who are still connected to these apostles. And he wants to expose the influence and the approach the apostles are taking for what it is. He wants to show that it's empty. He wants to show that the way they are conducting themselves is not valid and not godly. And so he turns his attention and he speaks about them openly. What you would have noticed is the tactic he uses is to talk about his weakness and not his strength. And this is very significant. Maybe you have heard one of the messages that Lauren Cunningham used to give a few years ago, and still does, I'm sure, when he talks about we respond in the opposite spirit. Very deliberately undermining the authority of the Apostle Paul, what he does is responds not by talking about his strengths and his great exploits, but he talks about his weakness. The opponents, if you read this through, one of the things that's helpful to do in passages like this is to reflect, to be looking very carefully at what is being said about them. And in chapter 4 we read that they're preaching another Jesus. In other words, the Jesus they're presenting is not the Jesus that the Apostle Paul is presenting. He's not the Jesus that he's spoken about in chapter 5. Possibly, if they were from Jerusalem and they were Judaizers, they may have had a focus trying to communicate Jesus as the conquering Messiah who's come to make Israel great again. Maybe that was something they were presenting. But the Apostle Paul never presents the gospel or Jesus as that. Certainly he never presented himself like that. When Jesus was with the disciples, you remember he said to them, "Who do people say that I am?" And Peter had this great revelation, "You are the Christ." And Jesus said, "You're right, don't tell anybody." And then he began to tell them what it meant for him to be the Messiah. I'm going up to Jerusalem. I'm going to be arrested. I'm going to suffer. And you remember how in that marvellous portion, this is Mark chapter 8, Peter took Jesus aside. It was like Peter said to Jesus, "Could you come into my office, please? Just take a seat. Now I want to explain to you what the Messiah does. I had the revelation you're the Messiah. Now let me explain to you, the Messiah is going to deliver us and conquer. If you think you're going to be arrested and suffer, you haven't read the book. This isn't the way it works. See? And you may remember how Jesus rebuked him very strongly. Really strong. He said, "Get behind me, Satan," because of the power of that temptation. He said, "This is not the way it's going to be." And it may well be that the kind of Jesus they were presenting was a Jesus more in keeping with the hopes and aspirations of Israel. We don't really know why he would say that. But it had to do with the distortion of the gospel, preaching another Jesus. This great term, super apostles, I love this because it gives such an indication of the way they must have been presenting themselves. These apostles with the big A on their shirt, you know, and coming in and boasting. False apostles. They were not teaching according to the right way. 11:13, deceitful workers, because they were communicating a gospel that was false. Servants of Satan, very strong. And so in this portion, the Apostle Paul, he uses very strong language. The reason he would do that is because what was at stake? What was at stake was the gospel, and the gospel, the true gospel, remaining in the Corinthian church. Because if they had embraced the teaching of these people, they would have ended up into deception and in error. And so the urgency of the situation called for this kind of language. And so we've already spoken about how these people were discrediting Paul to the Corinthians. We have looked at that. And what we're going to see is that when the apostle defends himself, particularly in chapter 11 and chapter 12, he uses a rhetorical device which would have been familiar to the people, the Corinthians. You saw in 1 Corinthians how the apostle said to them, he said to them their way in chapter 1, that some of you say, "I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, I'm of Cephas," and I don't know how much you got into this in your study of 1 Corinthians, but the thing that was behind that was the culture of travelling sophists or travelling itinerant speakers, philosophers, thank you. That's the word. Those people. And they would make their money with these public debates. They would make their money with these arguments. People come and listen, like this was a hot thing to do. We go to see a movie, they go to hear these people destroy one another verbally, you know. It's just... and who would win the debate. And one of the rhetorical devices that was first begun by Socrates was a form of apology, that is defense, whereby rather than talking about your exploits, you would talk about your weaknesses. Now, this, I'm telling you, has come from this here. Professor Andrew Lincoln has written a fabulous work here, and it's called Paradise Now and Not Yet. Guess where that title comes from? The now and the not yet, the overlap of the ages. And he's talking here particularly about 2 Corinthians, and he talks about this particular device whereby if a philosopher wanted to say something, rather than boast about themselves, they would take on the persona of the fool. Because when you're a fool, you can get away with anything, and people think you're foolish. And so they would take on the persona of a fool, and they would talk about themselves and do it in such a way as to expose the arguments of their opponents for the emptiness that they are. And so when the apostle says, I'm speaking as a fool, probably he, at least in part, is using this particular rhetorical device. And but there's a twist. Because speaking as a fool, rather than talking about the great things he's done, like the opponents, the super apostles, what he does is he talks about his weaknesses. And he talks about failures. He talks about a vision that he had, but actually he can't tell you what he saw. He talks about a prayer that's not answered. Now how's that for being a great apostle? You know, I asked God 3 times to do this. He said no. How many prayers could he have talked about when God said yes? You know, what great big long list of miracles could he have talked about where he had seen the dead raised and miraculous provision and miraculous protection? But he doesn't go there. And in it, he's trying to expose the emptiness of his opponents. Okay, let's just run through in the time we have left to see what these superlative or super apostles are saying. And when we come to chapter 10, verse 1, I want you to notice, is this the same in the ESV? I, myself, Paul. That is really redundant. You don't need to say that. I, myself, Paul. Now, the reason he says it is because it's kind of an emphasis. It's like today we would say, this is me speaking. Okay? This is important. It's me. Listen. I appeal to you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ, I who am humble when face to face with you, but bold towards you when I'm away. Now this was one of their accusations. You see, and probably it came out of the painful visit and the severe letter. The painful visit, it seems he wasn't a great big personality flying in to sort them out, but he went in with humility and it didn't seem to work, and it was very painful. But then he wrote the letter, and that letter seemed to be of a different caliber. And so the accusations of these apostles is, look at him, the guy's two-faced. I ask that when I am present, I need not show boldness by daring to oppose those who think I'm acting according to human standards. The Apostle Paul didn't want to have to go in and be really strong. He says the same in chapter 13. I'm coming again, get these things sorted out. Because when I come, I don't want to have to deal with these things. Deal with them before I come. We do not wage war according to human standards. The weapons of the world, the weapons that these opponents were using, were weapons like their personal influence coming from Jerusalem. Weapons like the credentials. I'm a Hebrew. I'm of Abraham. I'm a Jew. These sort of things. Their rhetorical skills. Their public speaking skills. These were the weapons, it seems, that's what they were using. And the apostle says we don't come with these worldly weapons, if you like, but rather we come, for the weapons of our warfare are not merely human, but they have divine power to destroy strongholds. He says a similar kind of thing in chapter 1, where he says, when we came to you, we didn't come with polished speech, but we came knowing simply the gospel, which is the power of God. And I may not have been great as I communicated it, but the gospel did its own work. It didn't need a person with great rhetorical skills to give it to you. I came and I knew Christ crucified. Christ crucified, the cross, it's foolishness to the Greeks. A dead Messiah, what kind of wisdom is that? And to the Jews it's a stumbling block, because their Messiah wasn't going to die. Their Messiah was going to conquer. And so he says, this is what I brought to you. But the gospel, it was the power of God bringing transformation for those who put their faith in Christ. So we destroy arguments and every proud obstacle, and that raises itself up against the knowledge of God. And then he continues in chapter 7, verse 7 following. He talks about now, even if I boast a little too much of our authority, which the Lord gave for building up and not for tearing you down, I will not be ashamed of it. For I do not want to seem as though I'm trying to frighten you with my letters. And so again, referring to the painful letter. For they say his letters are weighty and strong, but his bodily presence is weak and his speech is contemptible. I wonder if you've ever thought what the Apostle Paul looked like. Was he the 6'3", broad-shouldered, nice suit, impeccable tie, walking in? A kind of a little bit of a hint here that he wasn't a great person. In fact, some people say that he was short. Have you heard about this? Where do we get that from? Yeah.
The portraits of him.
Okay.
They're always shown as kind of short, bald, crooked nose.
Okay. He's probably had it broken a few times. Huh?
Big beard, full hair.
But he says, let such people understand that what we say by letter when absent, we will also do when present. And so an accusation of him being weak and intimidated. We go then to a very powerful passage in chapter 10, 12 following, something many of us need to take notice of. And that is the futility of comparing ourselves with one another. And he said that's what they do. But we do not dare to classify or compare ourselves as some of those who have commended themselves. For when they measure themselves by one another and compare themselves one with another, they're stupid. They don't show good sense. And that's how they considered themselves as super apostles, because they had their list of exploits and they compared themselves with other people and they came out better. But the apostle said that is stupid, because each one has their own field of ministry, field of work. And because each one has their own field, it's only God who is the one who commends, because he is the one who sees all things. And if you've been anything like me, one of the greatest traps is to look at what you do and what you are and compare yourselves with someone else. Because if you do that, either one or two things will happen. You'll either compare yourselves and think you're better and you'll be very proud, or you compare yourselves and think you're not as good and you'll be struggling with kind of inferiority and thinking that you're nothing. And both of those are not very good situations to be in. One of the things to recognize is, even as the apostle argues here, is that each one has a field or a ministry or an area assigned to them by God. And over the years, as I've seen what I've been doing, I've looked at other people and what they're doing, and I have thought, you know what, they are so much more fruitful than me. Why don't I just run off and become an evangelist? Because that's where it's at. Or a great miracle healer. These people who just seem to see miracles. They're obviously far better than me. Or whatever it has been. And as I reflected on it, I thought, well, maybe I could do that, but if I did that, who would do what I'm doing? Because this is the field that God has given me. And I need to do that in a way that pleases Him and receives benefit and credit and affirmation from Him. Because we're in the body of Christ and we all have different ministries and different gifts and different emphases. And one of the most foolish things is when we compare ourselves with other people. We need to guard our hearts against it, because it is destructive and it doesn't work, it doesn't bring any life. But what we do is we seek to be all we can in what God has called us in serving Him. And let Him be the one who responds and affirms. And so he says in verse 15, we do not boast beyond limit. That is, in the labour of others. But our hope is that as your faith increases, our sphere of action among you will be greatly enlarged, so that we may proclaim the good news in lands beyond you. It is possible that when he talks about these people boasting beyond their limit, he's referring back to something that happened in Galatians chapter 2. In Galatians chapter 2, there's discussion between Paul and the guys in Jerusalem, the leaders in Jerusalem, and it was agreed there that Peter would preach the gospel to the Jews and Paul to the Gentiles. Now, that doesn't mean that Paul could never speak to Jews, and of course it doesn't mean that Peter could never speak to Gentiles. We know he did to Cornelius, you see. But that would be their general sphere. And it may be that these people had come from Jerusalem, and what they were trying to do was to piggyback on all of the work that Paul had done in Corinth. But this was his field. This is what he had done. His desire, as we have seen, is that the church in Corinth could be so established that he could leave them and go to a whole new field. Again, read Romans, because that's what he wants to do. At the end of Romans, he talks about this. He wants to go to a whole new area where no one has gone, so he can start something new. That's, I guess, the real apostle. And so they are trying to piggyback on his benefit, and they compare themselves, and he said, don't do this, this is really stupid. Then we come into chapter 11, and it talks there about the deception and them preaching another Jesus. We've talked about that, and ministering in a different spirit. We've talked about most of these things already, but one of the interesting things in chapter 11 verse 7 has to do with money. Now this is really interesting to me, because you find this in 1 Corinthians and it comes again in 2 Corinthians. In 1 Corinthians he spends a whole chapter 9. It's one of these interesting chapters, because he spends most of the time arguing he has a right for them to give him money. But then he says, I haven't taken that right. And then he goes back again, but you should give me money. I have a right to take it from you. But I haven't. Now, we can ask the question, why was this a problem? Why wouldn't they be happy? You know, this is a cheap apostle. He earns his own money. We like this man, you know. Well, one possibility was because in the worldview of the Corinthian people, it has to do with the philosophers again. In the understanding, if a philosopher had to work with their hands, that proved they were not very good. Therefore, it is very demeaning for a philosopher to have to make tents or build cabinets or whatever. It meant that they were not able to make money through their craft of rhetoric and speaking. And so it may be that the fact that Paul chose to earn his own keep there may well be that they look down on him for that. Or it may be, compared to these super apostles, they took that right. And maybe that was a negative thing on the Apostle Paul. He didn't. And so the question was, why doesn't he? Maybe these things, but it does seem to be a problem. Did I commit a sin, chapter 11 verse 7, by humbling myself so that you may be exalted, because I proclaimed God's good news to you free of charge? Did I commit a sin in doing that? I robbed other churches by accepting support from them in order to serve you. And when I was with you, I was in need, I did not burden anyone, for my needs were supplied by the friends who came from Macedonia. So I refrained and will continue to refrain from burdening you in any way. As the truth of Christ is in me, this boast of mine will not be silenced in the regions of Achaia. And why? Because I do not love you? God knows I do. So this issue of money seemed to be an issue. And probably for the reasons I've said. Okay, just 5 minutes. Let's just have a look at chapter 11. Chapter 16. This is where he turns to this area of being a fool. And he says that, I'm going to boast, but I boast as a fool. And then let's go down to verse 21. Halfway through. But whatever anyone dares to boast of, I am speaking as a fool. I also dare to boast of that. This is why we can say with confidence that the opponents here were Jewish, and therefore either the same or similar to the circumcision party we find in Galatians and also in Philippians chapter 3. Are they Hebrews? So am I. See, he starts by boasting on the same level as them. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they descendants of Abraham? Now, he's kind of said the same thing 3 times. Do you notice that? Yeah. Kind of real, maybe there's a slight difference in these, but a real strong statement of his roots. Are they descendants of Abraham? So am I. Are they ministers of Christ? I'm talking like a madman. I'm a better one. Now, of course, what he should do then is to go on and say, I have planted more churches than they planted. I have seen more people raised from the dead. I have seen more miracles. I have seen more conversions. I've seen, I've written more books. I have a television station. I have conferences where 40,000 come. You can hear all these boastings that could be there, but he doesn't. He does this twist of irony. Far greater labours, far more imprisonments. Now, he's writing this in the 3rd missionary journey, so everything he says here is before going to Jerusalem, being in prison in Caesarea, the shipwreck, Rome, the prison in Rome. All of this is before then. And this gives us a clue that the Acts of the Apostles, that Luke, necessarily of course, misses a lot out. Far more imprisonments, countless floggings, often near death. 5 times I received from the Jews 40 lashes minus 1. The reason it's minus 1 is because in the law it says very clearly that when someone is beaten with rods, they cannot be beaten more than 40 times. And so the Jews at this time, when they brought that discipline, they would only beat someone 39 times just in case they miscounted and broke the law. See? So 40 lashes minus 3 times I've been beaten with rods. One of those was probably Philippi. Once I was stoned. That's Lystra. 3 times I've been shipwrecked. Now, we don't have any record of these because the one in Acts is after this. So in Acts, when he was in that storm and shipwreck, it's kind of like, oh, here we go again. You know, kind of been here, done this. 3 times I've been shipwrecked. For a night and a day, I was adrift at sea. How's that? Probably clinging to a lump of wood. I don't think they had lifeboats. Who knows? But he was just floating around. On frequent journeys, well, we know that. In danger from rivers, and that was because not all rivers would have bridges. And you'd have to cross them by walking through them. And you lose your footing and get swept away. Danger from bandits. Danger from my own people. Well, we see that in the book of Acts. Danger from Gentiles. We see that in Ephesus and Philippi. Danger in the city. Danger in the wilderness. Danger at sea. Danger from false brothers and sisters. In toil and hardship through many a sleepless night. Hungry and thirsty, often without food. Cold and naked. This is not the repertoire of that great powerful apostle. And beside other things, I am under daily pressure because of my anxiety for the churches. Obviously he should have more faith, shouldn't he? Why don't you just trust God more? See, this is the reality of the now and the not yet. He was a man of wonderful faith, but there was still the pain and the anguish of these things that was going on. Who is weak and am not I weak? Who is made to stumble and am I not indignant? If I must boast, I'll boast of my weakness. And then we have this incident that we don't read about in the book of Acts, but we read about it here, that when his life was in danger in Damascus, he was let down in a basket and escaped through the wall. Now, this is him escaping. It's no great event. He's running away. And so again, he's talking about his weakness. And then he talks about revelations. And this great revelation, and to answer any questions may come about paradise and the different levels of heaven, all I know is what I read here. In other words, I know the same as you. I don't have any great understanding other than what we're told. But he had this amazing revelation. But he says, I can't tell you what I heard. So rather than talking about a vision and describing the vision in detail and wowing everybody, and talking about this deep insight that he had, that people go, gasp, amazing. He says, well, I've had a revelation too, but I can't tell you what I saw, and I can't tell you what I heard. So it's kind of a bit of a non-event as far as these people are concerned, and contrary. But if there was a key verse for the last chapters, I would have 12:6. But if I wish to boast, I would not be a fool, for I'd be speaking the truth. But I refrain from it, so that no one may think better of me than what is seen in me or heard from me. In other words, he's saying to them, I am not going to build myself up with all these great stories. It's very simply what you see is what you get. You judge. I don't want you to think more of me than what you see and what you hear. And then finally, he talks about this prayer. 3 times I appealed to the Lord. Let's just run up to this one. Therefore, to keep me from being too elated, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger from Satan to torment me, to keep me from being too elated. 3 times I appealed to the Lord about this, that it would leave me. But he said, my grace is sufficient for you, My power is made perfect in weakness. So I will boast all the more gladly of my weakness, so that the power of God may dwell in me. This thorn in the flesh is another one of those things that it raises a lot of questions. What was it exactly that he was suffering? And Calvin said it was spiritual temptation. And Luther said it was the opposition and persecution that continually was there all the time. It was like a thorn in the side. That language, incidentally, it comes from the Old Testament, and it was a statement that when Israel were in the wilderness, God said, if you don't destroy the Canaanites, they will end up being like a thorn in your side. They will kind of get you. So you need to clear the land of these people. And that's the language that is used. But people have come up with all sorts of things. Some have thought it was a physical problem. Some have suggested epilepsy. Some have thought it was eye trouble. In Galatians, the apostle speaks to the church and said, you would have torn out your eyes and given them to me. Kind of a metaphor, and they think that he was talking about a physical ailment with his eyes. Some have talked about malaria. Whenever you get this, you know that people don't know. And I actually think in the providence of God we don't know. I think that actually adds to the richness, because each one of us at different times may be praying and saying, God, would you deliver me from this situation? And the response God gives is, actually, I'm going to give you grace. We don't necessarily want to hear that. I'm going to give you grace. And the apostle used it as something in his life in a really powerful way. If you put a gun to my head and say, Philip, you have to tell me what you think, I would say it may well have been the continuing pressure of opponents that you read through most of his letters. These people undermining his ministry, contradicting him. And maybe that was what he was talking about, but we don't know. And so I think that becomes really powerful. And so the rest of the letter, I think, is very straightforward. He brings it to a conclusion. He says to them, I want you guys to be ready for my third visit. I trust that we will come and not find these issues still at hand. Check yourself. Make sure that you're in Christ. And then we know that he was going to visit them. And so he brings the letter to a conclusion. Wonderful passage, this last passage, where he refuses to boast of his greatness, but celebrates the weakness because it focuses on the work of Christ. When I'm weak, he says, I'm strong, because God's strength is made perfect in my weakness. What a wonderful thing. What hope it has when we're feeling weak. Huh? Amen.